Mike Renner. I am Steve Palazzolo. Today we're going to discuss our O-line and D-line grading, Mike, and try to give the people a little insight into how we do it here at Pro Football Focus. You wrote a great article on profootballfocus.com. You guys can go check that out. It's just called How We Grade O-line and D-line. So let's get into it in some of the specifics. I think the first thing we need to discuss, we're all about production here. We're all about, did you make the block or did you not? We're not looking at traits. We're not looking at knee bend when it comes to offensive linemen. We're not even looking at burst specifically when it comes to defensive linemen. It's all about, did you win or did you lose?
Yeah, not even technique either. If you have terrible technique but get your block executed correctly, we're going to give you a positive on that play because you did you executed your job. No matter if your coach is going to ream you out afterwards for have bad hand placement and stuff like that. We're not looking at that. We're just looking at, did you win or did you not? And that's the basis of our grading.
We've given a lot of positives for the old butt block every now and again. Sometimes when you're run blocking, you're a little out of position. You got to throw your butt into the guy and you get a positive. So we give guys credit when they make their blocks or when they defeat blocks properly. Here's the other thing that we hear quite a bit from fans and even some coaches who at first, they say, look, you don't know the assignments. You don't know what I'm teaching this guy. You don't know what's happening behind the scenes. But most coaches that we've talked to, as we talk through our process and explain to them what we're actually doing, they do come around. And there's been a lot of examples of coaches who are like, come on, PFF, you don't know what you're doing. And by the end of the meeting, they're like, all right, this does make sense. So we don't know the assignments, but we're still able to determine what a guy's trying to do on a given play.
That's the exact thing, is the fact that this whole complex game of football, all these complicated things that go into it, the assignment for any player on any given play is actually fairly simple when you break it down to the granular level. If it wasn't, they wouldn't be able to play as quickly. If they had to process all these different things and then come to a decision on what to do, they'd be playing very slow. At the end of the day, they are reading only a few things and then they execute it quickly. So the assignment, the more you know about football, the more you realize no one's really reinventing the wheel. There's everyone's running the same thing hundreds of times every single weekend. We see these plays again and again, and then at that point we can know, fairly well with fairly, certainty what the guys' assignments are.
Yeah, so I don't want to call it easy by any means, right? We don't want to piss off offensive linemen. They have a lot of hard work to do, but I think when you look at it, it's a nuanced game. It's a game that, starts on Monday and you're studying your opponent and there's a lot that goes into it. And it's like if you see this look, you block this way. If you see this look, you do something different. But ultimately, all that wraps up when this ball snapped. Yeah. And when the ball snapped, if the guard is trying to kick out the three technique, we can see that, even though maybe there's hours and hours and hours of nuanced film study that goes into it. So I think those are important points to bring up. But I also think it's important to say, look, most of the time we know the assignment. If there's a time where we just don't know the assignment, a blown stunt, we're willing to zero it out in our world, which is just not guess if you truly can't figure it out. So the one other thing to focus on, grading is not really stats-based. We're not focusing on, a lot of times a guy's pass blocking efficiency, which you could find in our premium stats, might not match up perfectly with his pass block grade because we'll get into all the different things that go in to that final grade.
Yeah, it's not stats-based. It is based on how you execute your job on any given play, and it goes over time, so consistency matters more than these highlight reel plays because you're collecting all these plays, 1,000 snaps over a season. Those 5 highlight reel plays might look great on tape, but it's those 995 other snaps that we're going to focus on.
All right, so let's get into more of the specifics and start with the run game. Okay, with the run game, it's all about gap control on both sides of the ball. And I think the thing that makes us more unique when you compare us to, say, an offensive line coach or a defensive line coach, we're trying to grade both sides of the ball. Yes. So we do actually try to take into account when the guard's blocking that defensive tackle, what's the defensive tackle trying to do and what's the guard trying to do? A lot of times an offensive line coach is just saying, hey, guard, did you execute the assignment I gave you? Yes. All right, that's a positive. Move on. A lot of plays in our world are just washes. They're expected plays because both guys are essentially trying to take the same gap and there's no clear winner.
Yeah, I've seen plays where guys have highlighted, this defensive lineman. Oh, look at him beating Joe Thomas on tape. Well, Joe Thomas had to go, account for the B gap before he got to go out to his man. And so you're not looking at, if you're just looking at it from a defensive line perspective, you might say, wow, great rush. But from an offensive line perspective, you say, oh, Joe Thomas had a different assignment on that play. He really didn't have a chance. And so we look at it from both perspectives and say, probably not that great of rush because the offensive lineman was in a bad position to begin with. So we take both sides into account.
Of course, screen passes, when we get into the pass game, the Joe Thomas example, there was a highlight of him losing to Myles Garrett last year on a screen pass. And it's like, well, he's trying to let him get upfield. Yeah. So we do take all of that stuff into account. When it comes to the run game, though, we mentioned, gap control and not being, as a defensive lineman, you don't want to be moved off the ball. You don't want to be taken out of the gap you're trying to play. As an offensive lineman, you're obviously trying to move the guy out of the gap.
Yes.
And then there's levels to this grading. Again, comparing to maybe the way coaches might grade it, they might just say yes or no. Did you win? Did you lose? Did you execute your assignment? What was your technique? We're going to give you more credit when you move a guy, 8 yards off the ball versus maybe just kind of sealing the hole.
Yeah, Lyle Collins dropping a linebacker at the second level is going to get our highest grade we can give out to an offensive lineman because it's about as dominant as you can do. You completely take a guy out of a play. That's better than just, moving a guy a few yards off the ball, but he could still feasibly make a play. So there are levels, and that's where you see, guys get higher and higher.
Yeah, so our grading system, it's from -2 to +2. So when we're talking about those positive run blocks, a +0.5, a +1, those are your +1 blocks are your real elite blocks on the offensive line. Your Travis Frederick reach blocks when he's taking a shade. It's not an impossible block for a center, but if you can get around the shade and steal it, you're essentially, making the defense lose a defender. You're gaining an extra gap offensively. That's why Travis Frederick is our top graded run blocking center. So the key with the run game that I always focus on, we're grading both sides, and we have to take into account both sides of the ball. There are also plays where the offensive lineman's not doing much, and the defensive lineman's kind of taking himself out of the play.
Yes.
And it's not all one-on-one. A lot of times a defensive lineman, he's getting a -1, and the offensive lineman, he's just getting a 0 because he's watching a guy take himself out of the gap.
Yeah, it really is. We focus on, again, the individual assignments, not necessarily just, what it looks like on tape. Oh, it looks like, he really reached this guy, when it's really the defensive lineman taking himself out of the play.
Yeah, the one other thing to focus on with the defensive line, the speed at which you're going to win. We'll talk about that in the pass game as well.
Yeah.
If you swim a guy right off the line, whether or not you finish the play in the run game, that's just going to add to that individual play grade. Let's get into the pass protection stuff. So, same thing with assignments. There are some stunts. There are some things where it's not that clear exactly how teams are supposed to handle it. But most of the time, we have a feel for what's happening on the stunts. But most plays are going to be one-on-one, and we're going to judge the defensive lineman versus the offensive lineman in that one-on-one situation.
That's the biggest thing. A lot of people criticize us for, who's picking up this blitz or who's picking up this stunt. That's not as important to us as the actual one-on-one interaction of how do you pass block when you are mano-a-mano. Because that, to us, is the biggest predictive thing going forward in terms of how good an offensive lineman is in pass protection, is how well they can handle themselves in those one-on-one situations. And so we have 3 levels of grading, 0.5, +1, plus 1.5, and then vice versa, -1.5, -1, -0.5 for offensive linemen. And with the speed of which you win and the quality with which you win that one-on-one interaction is what determines 0.5 +1 or 1.5.
Yeah, and when we're looking at offensive linemen, we're really focused on their losses, essentially. They're expected to win most of the time. They're going to win, about 80-85% of the time. You're trying to avoid those losses from a defensive line standpoint. You're going to lose most of the time. You're not going to get to the quarterback, so we focus on those wins. So we'll give a guy a raw grade. You kind of add it up at the end of the game, raw grade, and then we do a little bit of math that's essentially built around expectation. So essentially when you're pass blocking on 3rd and 10, with a 7-step drop, there's a different expectation there versus, a play action pass on 1st and 10. So all that stuff's in the database. So there's different levels of wins, and I think that's another example where the stats don't always match up with the grades. We have guys that have 8 pressure games that might have an average grade because 4 of those pressures were unblocked and they were schemed up, and they might just get a 0 expected grade, and we say, good job, defensive coordinator, you created that pressure, not necessarily the player.
Yeah, and I think the biggest thing also with that is sacks don't really get a higher grade than pressures, than hits, than even plays that don't result in pressure, but you dominated your man at the snap and the ball got out quicker than you anticipated. So the sack, the finishing of the play isn't necessarily important. Now, if you don't finish the play, you can be docked for that. If you beat a guy and then you fall down, you get to the quarterback and you miss a tackle, you can be docked for that. But the actual finishing of the sack oftentimes is just luck.
It's a good point because we can give a 1.5 really high grade for just a hurry, but the ball's out in 2.1 seconds. You whipped your man, he's done in 1.9 seconds. Right, so that's the harder thing to do is the point. Whereas if the quarterback held the ball, sacking him is actually not the hardest thing to do after you've already
expect you to make a tackle.
Right, after you've already beaten your man. So there are plays where we'll give a guy a 1.5 hurry or maybe a 0.5 sack if it takes place in 3.6 seconds, or maybe the quarterback runs into him. That's one other point I think we really need to focus on. It's not as simple as saying the offensive tackle was trying to block this defensive end and that guy got a sack. A lot of times we focus on and we look at the quarterback's drop. If he drops back to 9 and then he starts drifting back, that offensive lineman loses leverage, and it's really impossible to block a moving target. You're blocking with a specific landmark, in mind, and we adjust for that stuff too. So don't worry, offensive linemen. We feel your pain.
Yeah.
Maybe not physically, but we feel your pain, and we're not going to let the quarterback make you look bad. We do give or dock the quarterback for sacks quite often.
Yeah, it is.
In the time, in the time that it takes to. If the quarterback holds it too long, we're not necessarily going to expect the offensive lineman to hold their block for 3.5, 4.5 seconds. So that's your pass protection. Anything else to add for our viewers, Mike?
No, that's about it for offensive line grading.
All right, I love it. Go check out Mike Renner's piece, How We Grade Offensive and Defensive Line. And if you want to check out all those offensive and defensive line grades, go get yourself a PFF Elite package and get your premium stats, and wait till you see what those look like this summer with our new look.